They warned him to never touch this dog, but he didn't listen. What starts as a simple act of kindness to save a terrified, chained dog from a storm leads Ben into a world of secrets, heartbreak, and an unlikely bond that could change everything. Shadow, a ghostly white shepherd, was once a loyal companion to a woman's son who's long gone. Now, with only one trust left, will this dog's past bring redemption, or will it tear everything apart? What happens when Ben discovers that helping this dog means taking on a responsibility he never expected? Don't miss this unforgettable tale of love, loss, and second chances. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The moving truck rumbled away, leaving Ben Carter standing in the driveway of his new rental home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete, highlighting every imperfection of the weathered house before him. Paint peeled from the wooden siding like old scabs, and the porch steps creaked under his work boots. "Daddy, where should I put Mr. Whiskers?" Lily's voice called from behind him. She clutched her stuffed cat close to her chest, her backpack almost as big as she was. Ben turned to his daughter, forcing a smile, despite the weight in his chest. "How about we find your room first, sweetheart?" He reached for her small hand, weathered fingers wrapping around tiny ones. The house key stuck in the lock, requiring a firm jiggle before the door finally swung open with a protesting groan. The musty smell of abandonment rushed out to greet them, making Ben's nose wrinkle. Empty rooms echoed their footsteps as they walked through what would become their living room. "It's kind of scary," Lily whispered, pressing closer to his leg. "It just needs some love," Ben assured her, though his own doubts gnawed at him. The rent was cheap. It had to be, given his current situation. But looking at the water stains on the ceiling and the ancient wallpaper curling at the corners, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. A sudden snarl ripped through the air, making them both jump. Through the grimy living room window, Ben spotted their next-door neighbor's yard. An elderly woman stood on her porch, thin and stern as a fence post, watching them with hard eyes. But it was what lay beyond her that caught his attention. A massive white German shepherd chained to a gnarled oak tree. The dog's fur was like dirty snow, its muscles rippling as it lunged against its chain, snapping at invisible threats. Its eyes held a wild, unsettled look that made Ben's skin prickle with unease. "Come on, Lily. Let's start bringing in our things." He tried to guide her away from the window, but she remained transfixed. "Who's that dog?" Lily asked, pressing her small hands against the glass. Before Ben could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Stay away from that dog!" The elderly neighbor called out, her voice as brittle as dead leaves. "He isn't safe." Ben met the woman's gaze through the window. Her face was lined with years of what looked like bitterness, her mouth set in a permanent downward curve. She didn't wave or offer any welcome, just that cold warning before turning to go back inside her house. "Miss Edna Langley," Ben muttered, remembering the name from the rental agreement. The landlord had mentioned something about her being a long-time resident of the neighborhood. "He looks sad, Daddy," Lily said, still watching the dog. "Why is he tied up?" The German shepherd continued its agitated pacing, the chain rattling with each movement. Its white fur was dingy and unkempt, and even from this distance, Ben could see the way its ribs showed through its coat. "Some animals can be dangerous, Lily," Ben explained, finally managing to draw her away from the window. "Especially ones that have to be chained up. We need to stay away from him, okay?" Lily's lower lip trembled slightly. "But—" "No buts," Ben said firmly. "We have enough to worry about without getting involved with the neighbors. Now let's get your room set up." They spent the next few hours carrying in boxes and their few pieces of furniture. Each trip to the car, Ben felt Miss Edna's presence like a shadow, though she'd gone inside. The dog's periodic snarls and barks provided an unsettling soundtrack to their work. By the time night fell, they'd managed to set up Lily's bed and unpack enough to make the house somewhat livable. Ben's back ached from lifting boxes, and his mind was heavy with all the things still left to do. The mechanic job he'd lined up didn't start until next week, and their savings were stretched thin as old rubber. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Ben said, helping Lily into her pajamas. She climbed into bed, but instead of lying down, she knelt by her window, looking out into the darkness. "He looks lonely, Daddy," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the white shape visible in Miss Edna's yard. The dog had finally settled, lying in the dirt beneath the oak tree. But even in repose, there was something tragic about its solitary figure. Ben joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. For a moment, he allowed himself to really look at the dog. In the moonlight, its white fur seemed to glow, making it look almost ghostly. There was something in its posture, even from this distance, that spoke of defeat, a broken spirit. He pushed the thought away. They had their own problems to deal with. He couldn't afford to take on anyone else's troubles, not when he was barely keeping his head above water as it was. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, brushing Lily's hair back from her face. "He'll be all right." But as he tucked her into bed, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't believe his own words. The sound of the chain rattling in the darkness seemed to mock his reassurance, and the image of those wild, troubled eyes stayed with him long into the night. Thunder cracked overhead like a whip, rattling the windows of the old house. Ben sat on the edge of Lily's bed, trying to keep his voice steady as he read her favorite bedtime story. The wind howled through the gaps in the weathered window frames, and rain pelted against the glass in angry sheets. Lily pulled her blanket up to her chin, her eyes wide with each flash of lightning. "I don't like this storm, Daddy." "I know, sweetheart." Ben reached over to smooth her hair. "But we're safe inside. Try to think of it as nature's light show." Another thunderclap boomed, closer this time, making them both jump. The old house creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm. Ben glanced at the window, watching water stream down the glass in rivers. That's when he heard it, a sound different from the storm's fury. A long, pained whimper carried through the chaos outside. Ben's chest tightened as he rose from the bed and moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out Shadow's white form, still chained to that tree. The dog's fur was matted down, dark with rain, his body shaking violently in the downpour. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark detail. Shadow huddled against the tree trunk, chain pulling taut as he tried to find shelter that wasn't there. Ben's eyes darted to Miss Edna's house. It sat dark and silent, not a single light showing through any window. His stomach churned as he realized no one was coming to help the dog. "Daddy?" Lily's small voice came from behind him. She'd gotten out of bed and now stood beside him at the window. "Is that Shadow?" He's scared. Ben watched as another violent shiver racked the dog's body. "He'll be okay, Lily. Miss Edna will." But the words died in his throat as he looked again at the dark house next door. "He needs us, Daddy." Lily's voice trembled with emotion. "Please." Ben ran a hand through his hair, conflict churning in his gut. Getting involved with the neighbor's dog was the last thing he needed right now. But Lily's pleading eyes and the sound of Shadow's whimpering cut through his hesitation. "Stay inside," he said firmly, already reaching for his coat. "I mean it, Lily. Don't move from your room." Ben pulled on his boots by the front door, his hand shaking slightly as he tied the laces. What was he doing? This wasn't his problem. but he couldn't shake the image of Shadow trembling in the rain, or the sound of those frightened whimpers. The storm hit him full force as he stepped outside. Cold rain immediately soaked through his coat, and the wind nearly knocked him sideways. His boots sank into mud as he made his way across the yard toward Shadow. The dog's head snapped up as Ben approached. A deep growl rumbled from Shadow's throat, his teeth baring in a fierce snarl. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he took another careful step forward. Shadow's body tensed, hackles rising despite the rain plastering his fur down. But something made Ben pause. In the next flash of lightning, he caught a glimpse of Shadow's eyes. Behind the aggressive display, there was something else, raw fear. The dog wasn't dangerous. He was terrified. "Easy," Ben said softly, barely audible over the storm. "Easy there, boy." Shadow's growl continued, but he didn't lunge as Ben inched closer. The chain rattled as the dog pressed himself against the tree, trying to appear threatening while simultaneously trying to disappear. Ben's fingers fumbled with the chain's clasp, rain making everything slick. Shadow could have easily bitten him. The dog's teeth were inches from Ben's hands. But instead, Shadow just stood there, tense and shivering, as Ben worked the chain free. The moment the chain fell away, Ben stepped back, half expecting Shadow to bolt or attack. But the dog did neither. He simply stood there, rain streaming off his body, looking somehow smaller without the chain. The fierce display from moments ago had vanished, leaving behind something that looked defeated and lost. "Come on," Ben said gently, gesturing toward the house. "Let's get you out of this rain." To his surprise, Shadow followed him, padding silently through the mud to the front door. Inside, the dog stood dripping on the floor, water pooling around his paws. His eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, but he made no aggressive moves. He simply lay down near the door, watching Ben with cautious attention. The sound of small feet made Ben turn. Lily stood in the hallway, wrapped in her blanket like a cape. "Lily, I told you to stay in your room," he said, but his voice lacked real anger. "Is he okay?" she asked, taking a step toward Shadow. "Stay back," Ben warned, but Shadow didn't react to Lily's approach. The dog's eyes followed her movement, but his body remained still, no hint of a growl. Lily moved closer, her small hand extending slowly toward Shadow. Ben's heart jumped to his throat, but before he could stop her, her fingers made contact with Shadow's wet fur. The dog didn't flinch or pull away. He simply watched her, something shifting in his eyes. For the first time since Ben had seen him, Shadow's gaze held a glimmer of trust. Ben stood rooted to the spot, water dripping from his coat onto the floor, watching his daughter connect with the dog everyone had warned them about. What had he gotten himself into? Morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Ben rubbed his tired eyes as he made his way down the creaky stairs. His back ached from a night spent tossing and turning, worried about the decision he'd made in the storm. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused. Shadow was exactly where they'd left him last night, curled up near the front door. The dog's white fur had dried into messy clumps, and his massive body rose and fell with ragged breaths. Those intelligent eyes, filled with a deep sadness, followed Ben's every movement. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, wrapped in her favorite purple blanket. She'd clearly been up for a while, just watching their unexpected guest. Her small face was full of concern as she looked up at her father. "Can we keep him, Daddy?" she asked in a whisper, as if afraid to startle the dog. Ben ran a hand through his disheveled hair, buying time before answering. Shadow didn't look dangerous anymore, not like the snarling, aggressive animal they'd first seen chained in Miss Edna's yard. Now he just looked broken, like something inside him had given up. "We'll have to see," Ben finally responded, his voice gentle but non-committal. He couldn't make promises, not when they were barely settled in their new home themselves. In the kitchen, Ben went through the motions of making breakfast, his movements slow and mechanical. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with its familiar sound. His mind wandered to Miss Edna. She hadn't come looking for Shadow yet. The old woman's house remained still and silent next door. "Daddy," Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding a bowl of dry cereal. "Can I give some to Shadow?" Ben hesitated but nodded. "Just be careful, okay?" Lily approached Shadow slowly, setting the bowl down a few feet away from him. "Here you go," she said softly. "You must be hungry." Shadow lifted his head, his nostrils twitching as he sniffed the air. But after a moment, he just laid his head back down, ignoring the food. Lily sat down next to the bowl, not discouraged. "You're not alone anymore, okay?" she told the dog, her voice full of that pure, simple kindness that children seem to possess naturally. "We'll take care of you." Ben watched the interaction from the kitchen, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Something about the scene made his chest tight. His daughter's compassion, the dog's quiet suffering. Shadow wasn't what he'd thought at first. There was no aggression now, just weariness. After breakfast, Ben decided they needed to get Shadow outside. The dog needed exercise, and honestly, Ben needed to see how he'd behave in the open. "Come on, boy," Ben called, opening the back door. Shadow didn't move. "Shadow," Lily tried, taking a step toward the door. To Ben's amazement, the dog slowly got to his feet, following her cautious movements. The backyard was small but fenced, perfect for a dog. The grass was still wet from last night's storm, and the air held that clean, fresh smell that follows rain. Lily found an old tennis ball in the garage and held it up. "Want to play?" she asked Shadow. Ben watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Shadow's ears perked up slightly. Lily tossed the ball, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, like something awakening from a long sleep, Shadow moved. He didn't run, not exactly, but he trotted after the ball, picked it up, and brought it back to Lily. "Look, Daddy!" Lily's face lit up with joy. "He knows how to play!" Ben felt a smile tugging at his own lips. For the first time, he saw Shadow act like a normal dog, not the frightened, aggressive animal from Miss Edna's yard, but a pet who remembered what it was like to play. The rest of the day passed quietly. Shadow stayed close to Lily, following her movements with watchful eyes. He still wouldn't eat much, but he did accept water from a bowl Ben put out for him. As evening approached, Ben and Lily sat down to dinner, simple sandwiches and soup. Shadow lay near the kitchen table, his head on his paws. Ben found himself glancing at the dog between bites, noting how much calmer he seemed compared to yesterday. "He's not a bad dog, Daddy," Lily whispered, following her father's gaze. "He just needs someone to love him." Ben nodded, but uncertainty clouded his thoughts. He was starting to care about Shadow. How could he not? But there were so many questions. What would Miss Edna say? Could they really take care of a dog? Would Shadow ever fully trust them? The dog's eyes met his across the kitchen, and in that moment, Ben saw something he hadn't noticed before, a glimmer of hope beginning to replace the sadness. The sharp rapping at the door jolted Ben awake. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and his clock showed it was barely 7 in the morning. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Ben stumbled down the stairs, his mind still foggy from sleep. Shadow lay in his usual spot near the door, his ears perked up at the noise. The dog's white fur gleamed in the morning light, making him look almost ghostly. When Ben opened the door, Miss Edna stood there, her thin frame trembling with rage. Her gray hair was disheveled, and her eyes blazed with an intensity that made Ben take a step back. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning quiet. Ben blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. I just helped the dog. He was in the storm." Miss Edna didn't wait for him to finish. She pushed past him, her small body surprisingly forceful. Her shoes clicked against the wooden floor as she marched straight toward the kitchen where Shadow lay. "You had no right," she snapped, pointing a bony finger at Ben. "That dog belongs to me." Shadow's ears flattened against his head at the sound of her voice, but he didn't growl. He just watched, his eyes moving between Ben and Miss Edna. "He was out there in the rain," Ben said, keeping his voice steady despite his rising frustration. "He was cold and scared. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to mind your own business." Miss Edna's voice cracked. "Who do you think you are, coming here and... She stopped, her hands shaking. Ben took a deep breath. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, and somewhere upstairs he could hear Lily stirring. "Why was he chained up in the first place?" Ben asked, his voice softer now. "He's been out there since we moved in. I've never seen you walk him, or... You don't understand." Miss Edna's voice trembled with emotion. She seemed to deflate, her anger giving way to something deeper, more painful. "That dog only trusts one person, my son Caleb." Her voice caught on the name. "He's gone now. He died in a car crash 2 years ago." The kitchen fell silent. Even Shadow seemed to react to Caleb's name, his ears twitching slightly. "I'm sorry," Ben said quietly. "I didn't know." But questions still nagged at him. He looked at Shadow, then back at Miss Edna. "But why keep him chained up? Why not—" "Keep him," Miss Edna cut him off, her voice sharp again. "Keep him inside. Just stay out of my business." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold something in. "You don't understand. You can't understand." Footsteps on the stairs made them both turn. Lily stood there in her pajamas, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "What's happening?" she asked in a small voice. Miss Edna's face softened for just a moment when she saw Lily, but she quickly turned away. "Keep that dog inside," she repeated, already heading for the door, "and stay out of my life." Ben watched her go, feeling the weight of more questions pressing down on him. The door slammed behind her, making Shadow flinch. Lily came down the rest of the stairs, her bare feet quiet on the wood floor. She went straight to Shadow, who seemed to relax slightly at her presence. "What's going to happen to Shadow, Daddy?" she asked, her voice full of worry. Ben looked at his daughter, then at the dog who had somehow become part of their lives overnight. The morning sun caught in Shadow's fur, making him look almost ethereal. "I don't know, sweetheart," he whispered, the truth of those words settling heavily in his chest. "I don't know." He watched as Lily sat down next to Shadow, her small hand resting gently on his white fur. The dog didn't move away from her touch, and Ben could see the trust building between them, despite everything that had happened. Through the window, he could see Miss Edna's house, silent and still in the morning light. Something was wrong there, something more than just grief. But for now, all he could do was stand in his kitchen, watching his daughter comfort a dog who carried more secrets than any of them understood. Ben wiped the grease from his hands with a shop rag, his mind wandering back to Shadow and Miss Edna. The garage was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clang of tools. Most of the other mechanics had gone home, leaving just him and Mike for the evening shift. Mike wheeled out from under a beaten-up Chevy, his coveralls stained with oil. "You're awful quiet tonight, Carter." Something eating at you?" Ben hesitated, then set down his wrench. "You've been in town long, right?" "Born and raised," Mike said, reaching for his coffee cup. "Why?" "What do you know about Miss Edna Langley?" Mike's hand froze halfway to his mouth. He lowered the cup slowly, his expression growing serious. "Miss Edna? What's got you mixed up with her?" Ben explained about Shadow, the storm, and the confrontation that morning. As he spoke, Mike's frown deepened. "Listen to me carefully," Mike said, his voice low and firm. "You don't get involved with Miss Edna, especially not with that dog. She lost her son, and now Shadow is all she has left. That dog's been through hell. Trust me, it's better for everyone if you just let it go." Ben leaned against the workbench. "But the way she treats Shadow—" "It's not our business," Mike cut him off. "Look, I knew Caleb. Good kid. That dog was his service animal. Followed him everywhere. After the accident—" Mike shook his head. "Miss Edna changed. Whole town knows, to give her space." Ben felt his stomach twist. Something about the situation didn't sit right, but Mike's warning was clear. He tried to focus on the engine in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting to Shadow's sad eyes and Miss Edna's anger. When Ben got home that night, he found Lily sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. Shadow lay nearby, his head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes followed Ben as he entered, but there was no growling, no tension in his body. "How was he today?" Ben asked, hanging up his jacket. "Good," Lily said, not looking up from her homework. "He ate all his dinner. And guess what, Daddy? He played with my tennis ball again." Ben watched as Lily reached out to pat Shadow's head. The dog didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, accepting the touch. It was such a small thing, but Ben remembered how Shadow had been just days ago, snarling, wild-eyed, dangerous. "You're such a good boy," Lily whispered to Shadow. "You just needed someone to be nice to you, didn't you?" Ben felt that familiar ache in his chest. Despite Mike's warning, he couldn't ignore the changes in Shadow. The dog was calmer now, more present. The fearful gleam in his eyes had softened, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Later that night, after tucking Lily into bed, Ben sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Shadow lay in his usual spot by the door, but his eyes were alert, watching Ben. The dog's breathing was steady now, not the ragged pants of those first few days. "What happened to you?" Ben murmured, more to himself than to Shadow. The dog's ears twitched at his voice. Ben thought about what Mike had said about Shadow being Caleb's service dog. He tried to imagine the bond between them, the trust that must have existed. No wonder Shadow had been so broken after losing Caleb. Around midnight, Ben woke to an odd sound. He opened his eyes to find Shadow standing in his bedroom doorway, staring intently at the empty corner of the room. The dog's posture was rigid, his ears forward, and a soft whine escaped his throat. Ben sat up slowly, not wanting to startle him. Shadow didn't move, didn't even seem to notice Ben was awake. His eyes remained fixed on that empty corner, as if seeing something Ben couldn't. The air felt heavy, charged with something Ben couldn't explain. He watched Shadow, feeling an overwhelming urge to understand what was happening. The dog whined again, softer this time, and Ben felt goosebumps rise on his arms. There was more to Shadow's story than Miss Edna had revealed. Ben was sure of it now. The dog wasn't just a reminder of her son. He was carrying his own grief, his own memories of Caleb. And somehow, in this quiet moment in the dark, Ben felt like he was witnessing something deeply personal, a glimpse into Shadow's hidden world of loss and remembrance. Shadow's tail lowered slightly, and he let out a long breath. His eyes never left that corner, but the tension in his body gradually eased. Ben sat in silence, unwilling to break whatever moment Shadow was experiencing. In the stillness of the night, Ben realized that despite Mike's warning, despite Miss Edna's anger, despite his own initial fears, he couldn't just let it go. Shadow wasn't just a troubled dog anymore. He was becoming part of their family, carrying his own story of love and loss that Ben was only beginning to understand. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Ben prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, and Shadow lay quietly near the back door, his white fur gleaming in the early light. Ben glanced at the clock. They needed to get moving soon. "Time to go outside, boy," Ben said, reaching for the door handle. Shadow's ears perked up, but he didn't move. His body went rigid, and his eyes fixed on Ben with an unmistakable plea. Ben grabbed a treat from the box on the counter. "Come on, Shadow. Just for a little while." He held out the treat, but Shadow turned his head away, pressing himself closer to the floor. Lily appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. "What's wrong, Daddy?" "Shadow won't go outside," Ben explained, showing her the rejected treat. "He needs to, though. We can't keep him inside all day." Lily padded over to Shadow in her bare feet and knelt beside him. "It's okay," she whispered, her small hand resting on his back. "Nobody's going to hurt you out there. We'll protect you." Shadow's eyes softened at her touch, and his tail gave a slight wag. Ben watched in amazement as the dog slowly rose to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate. "That's it," Lily encouraged, reaching for the leash hanging by the door. Shadow allowed her to clip it to his collar, though his body remained tense. "See? We can do this together." Ben held the door open wider, and Shadow took a hesitant step forward. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at Ben with uncertain eyes. There was something in that look that tugged at Ben's heart, a mix of fear and trust that made him want to close the door and tell Shadow he could stay inside forever. Instead, he nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, boy. We're right here." Shadow finally stepped outside, staying close to Lily's side as she led him into the backyard. Ben watched them from the doorway, his coffee growing cold in his hand as he observed their careful dance of trust and reassurance. Later that day, after lunch, Ben tried again to let Shadow out. This time, the dog wouldn't budge at all. He lay near the couch, his eyes following Ben's movements, but his body completely still. Ben ran a hand through his hair, considering his options. The dog needed exercise, needed fresh air, but forcing him outside seemed cruel somehow. Shadow's fear was real, even if Ben didn't understand its source. "Maybe we can let him stay in a little longer," Lily suggested from her spot on the floor, where she was working on her homework. "He feels safe here." Ben looked around their small living room. Shadow had already claimed a spot near the window where he could watch the street outside while staying protected within the house's walls. His water bowl sat in the kitchen, and the old blanket they'd given him was neatly arranged in the corner. "All right," Ben conceded, "but just for today." As evening approached, they settled into their routine. Ben prepared dinner while Lily set the table, chattering about her day at school. Shadow watched them intently, his head moving back and forth between them, as if keeping track of their movements. When they sat down to eat, Shadow positioned himself near Lily's chair, his body alert but relaxed. Ben noticed how the dog's eyes would scan the room periodically, as if checking for threats, but always returned to Lily. "He's like my guardian," Lily giggled as Shadow's tail brushed against her leg. Ben watched them, thinking about how different Shadow was from the snarling, aggressive dog they'd first encountered. This Shadow was protective, gentle, and increasingly attached to their small family. But there was still something haunted in his eyes, something that spoke of past trauma and deep isolation. "Dad," Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can we watch a movie tonight?" "Sure, sweetheart, just one though. It's a school night." They moved to the living room after dinner, settling onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn. Without hesitation, Shadow padded over and lay down at Lily's feet. His body curled protectively around her ankles. Ben sighed, accepting what he'd known was coming all along. Shadow wasn't just seeking temporary shelter. He was making himself at home. The realization should have worried him more. But as he watched his daughter absently stroke Shadow's fur while the movie played, he couldn't bring himself to feel concerned. This dog, who had been chained and alone for so long, had found his way into their lives and their hearts. Ben still had questions about Shadow's past, still wondered about Miss Edna's warnings and the mystery of her son. But for now, he was content to let Shadow be part of their family. As the movie's credits rolled, Lily had dozed off on the couch, and Shadow remained steadfast at her feet, his eyes half closed but alert. Ben covered Lily with a blanket and patted Shadow's head. "You're home now, boy," he whispered, and Shadow's tail thumped softly against the floor in response. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Ben sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and watching Shadow's peculiar behavior. Lily had found an old tennis ball in the garage and was trying to engage the dog in a game of fetch. "Here, Shadow! Look at the ball!" Lily tossed it gently across the room. The ball bounced and rolled to a stop near Shadow's paws. Shadow didn't move. His white fur gleamed in the sunlight, but his eyes were distant, unfocused, as if he was looking through the ball rather than at it. Ben frowned, noting how the dog's usual alertness seemed replaced by something else, a kind of emptiness that made his chest tighten. "He doesn't want to play, sweetie," Ben said softly, but Lily tried again, her small hands picking up the ball and giving it another gentle toss. Still nothing. Shadow remained still, lost in whatever thoughts occupied his mind. Ben had seen dogs before, playful, energetic creatures that would chase anything that moved. But Shadow was different. It was as if he'd forgotten how to be a dog. Ben continued to observe throughout the morning. Shadow hadn't touched his breakfast, the kibble sitting untouched in his bowl. But the moment Lily walked into the kitchen for her own breakfast, something changed in Shadow. His tail began to wag, his eyes focused, and he moved toward his food bowl. Only then, with Lily nearby, did he begin to eat. "That's it, good boy," Lily encouraged, and Shadow's tail wagged faster. The change was striking. It was like watching a switch being flipped, from disconnected to present, from distant to engaged. But only when Lily was there. The moment she left the room, Shadow would retreat back into himself, becoming once again the ghost of a dog. By mid-morning, Ben couldn't shake his growing concern. He needed answers. After making sure Lily was occupied with her coloring books, he headed next door to Miss Edna's house. His footsteps felt heavy on the worn wooden steps of her porch. He knocked, and after a long moment, Miss Edna opened the door just enough to peer out. Her face was lined with suspicion. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you about Shadow," Ben said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "There's something wrong with him, isn't there? Something more than just being difficult or dangerous." Miss Edna's lips pressed into a thin line. "I told you to stay out of it." "Please," Ben persisted. "I'm trying to help him, but I can't if I don't understand what's wrong." For a moment, Ben thought she would slam the door in his face, but something in his words seemed to reach her. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The inside of Miss Edna's house was dim and cluttered with memories. Photos lined the walls, and Ben's eyes were drawn to one in particular. A young man with a bright smile, his arm around a younger, healthier-looking Shadow. Miss Edna followed his gaze. "That's Caleb," she said, her voice catching. My son. She lowered herself into an old armchair, her movements slow and careful. You think he's broken now, but you don't know what he's been through. He was a service dog, trained for my son Caleb, but after the accident. Ben sat on the edge of the couch, waiting as Miss Edna gathered herself. Shadow wasn't just any dog, she continued. He was specially trained to help Caleb. They were inseparable. Shadow knew when Caleb needed him, knew how to help, how to protect him. They had a bond that was... She trailed off, her eyes distant. What happened? Ben asked softly. The accident was 2 years ago. Caleb... Miss Edna's voice broke. Shadow was in the car too. He survived, but after losing Caleb, he just changed. Stopped trusting, stopped living, really. Just existed. I couldn't help him, couldn't reach him. Maybe I didn't try hard enough. Ben absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. Shadow's reluctance to engage, his attachment to Lily, his distant stares. They weren't signs of aggression or bad temperament. They were symptoms of grief, of trauma so deep it had fundamentally changed him. When Ben returned home, he found Shadow sitting by the window, his usual spot when Lily wasn't around. The dog's profile was silhouetted against the afternoon light, still and solemn. Ben looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just a troubled dog, but a creature carrying years of loss and pain. Lily walked over to Shadow, her small hand reaching out to pat his head. You're not alone anymore, Shadow, she whispered. Ben watched them, his heart heavy with understanding. Shadow wasn't just a stray they'd taken in. He was a survivor, carrying wounds that went far deeper than anyone could see. As Lily continued to pet him, Shadow's tail gave a small wag, a tiny spark of life in those haunted eyes. Ben stood on Miss Edna's porch, his hand hovering over the door. The morning was quiet, except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. After a moment's hesitation, he knocked firmly. Miss Edna opened the door, her face lined with exhaustion. She looked older somehow, more fragile than she had yesterday. What do you want now? She asked, but the usual bite was missing from her voice. I need to understand, Ben said softly. About Caleb, about Shadow. Please. Miss Edna's shoulders slumped slightly. She stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. The house was dim and cluttered with memories, photos on every wall, dusty trinkets on shelves, and a familiar-looking dog leash hanging by the door. They sat in her living room, where a large photo of a young man dominated the mantel. He was smiling broadly, his arm around a younger, healthier-looking Shadow. That's Caleb, Miss Edna said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes fixed on the photograph, lost in memories. He was a good boy, always trying to make me proud. She reached for a tissue from a nearby box. He loved that dog more than anything. Ben waited patiently as Miss Edna gathered herself. The room felt heavy with unspoken grief. Caleb died in a car accident 2 years ago, she continued, her voice breaking. Just before he was supposed to come home. Shadow was with him. She twisted the tissue in her hands. The dog survived the crash, but the words seemed to catch in her throat, and she couldn't continue. Ben leaned forward slightly. So Shadow's not just a dog. He's been waiting for Caleb to return. Miss Edna nodded silently, wiping away tears that had begun to fall. He hasn't been the same since. The only person who could get through to him was Caleb, and now that he's gone... She shook her head helplessly. I don't know how to help him. Ben's chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. Shadow's distant stares, his reluctance to play or engage, the way he seemed to be looking for something, or someone who wasn't there. The dog wasn't just afraid or aggressive. He was grieving, waiting for a master who would never return. "What was Shadow like before?" Ben asked gently. "With Caleb?" Miss Edna's face softened slightly. "Oh, they were inseparable. Shadow was his service dog, you see. Caleb had—" She paused, collecting her thoughts. "He had some health issues. Shadow was trained to help him, to protect him. That dog knew what Caleb needed before Caleb did sometimes." She stood up slowly and walked to a shelf, pulling down a photo album. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. "Look," she said, showing Ben a picture of Shadow and Caleb playing in a backyard. The dog in the photo was almost unrecognizable. Tail high, eyes bright, fully engaged with life. "They were everything to each other," Miss Edna continued. "After the accident, I think Shadow blamed himself. He was supposed to protect Caleb, you see. That's what he was trained for." Her voice cracked. "How do you explain to a dog that some things can't be prevented?" Ben felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He thought about Shadow, lying in his living room right now, probably still watching the door, still waiting. "I couldn't help him," Miss Edna admitted, her voice small. "I tried, but every time I looked at Shadow, I saw Caleb. And Shadow. He just withdrew more and more. That's why I—" She gestured vaguely toward the backyard where the chain still lay. "I couldn't bear to see him suffering, but I couldn't let him go either. He's all I have left of my son." Ben understood now why Shadow had been chained outside. It wasn't cruelty, but a complicated mix of grief and inability to cope. Miss Edna had been trapped in her own pain, unable to help Shadow through his. "He's starting to trust Lily," Ben said softly. "Maybe that's a sign." Miss Edna looked up, her eyes wet with tears. "Maybe," she whispered. "But will it be enough?" Ben stood up, feeling a new sense of purpose. Shadow wasn't just a dog who needed a home. He was a creature who had lost his whole world and didn't know how to move forward. The responsibility felt enormous, but Ben knew he couldn't walk away now. As he left Miss Edna's house, determination surged through him. He paused on the porch, looking back at the dim interior where Miss Edna sat surrounded by her memories. The situation was more complex than he'd ever imagined, but he was ready to help Shadow find his way back to life, no matter what it took. When he walked through his own door, Lily looked up from where she sat on the floor next to Shadow. "Did you talk to Miss Edna?" Ben nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, Shadow's been through a lot, sweetheart." Lily smiled, her hand resting gently on Shadow's white fur, unaware of the weight of the story, but content to have the dog by her side. Ben sat in the living room's worn armchair, morning light filtering through the dusty windows. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten on the side table as he watched Lily and Shadow in the corner. The events of yesterday's conversation with Miss Edna weighed heavily on his mind, each detail adding another layer to his understanding of Shadow's pain. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging her stuffed animals in a circle. Shadow lay nearby, his white fur catching the sunlight, making him look almost ethereal. His eyes followed Lily's movements, but his body remained still, like a statue guarding its post. "This is Mr. Whiskers," Lily explained to Shadow, holding up a well-loved teddy bear. "He likes to take naps, too, just like you." Shadow's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't move otherwise. Ben watched from the doorway, his heart heavy with a mixture of compassion and guilt. The image of Miss Edna's tear-stained face as she spoke about Caleb wouldn't leave his mind. Shadow wasn't just a neglected dog. He was a loyal companion trapped in a prison of grief, waiting endlessly for someone who would never return. Can dogs even move past something like that? Ben muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. The question haunted him. Shadow needed more than just food and shelter. He needed to heal, to understand that it was okay to live again, to trust again. But how do you explain that to a dog? Lily continued her gentle chatter, unaware of her father's heavy thoughts. And this is Princess Sparkles, she said, showing Shadow a pink unicorn. She's magical, you know. She makes people feel better when they're sad. Ben watched as Shadow's eyes tracked the toy, noting how the dog's posture remained alert but not tense. There was something different about him now, a softness that hadn't been there before. The wild, desperate look in his eyes had faded, replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. Taking a deep breath, Ben made a decision. He stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and walked toward Shadow. The dog's eyes shifted to him but didn't show any signs of fear or aggression. Ben lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged about a foot away from Shadow. "Hey, buddy," Ben said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Shadow's ears perked up, his head tilting slightly. "I know you've been through a lot. I know you're still waiting for him." Lily stopped playing, watching the interaction with wide, curious eyes. She hugged Princess Sparkles to her chest, hardly daring to breathe. Ben slowly extended his hand, letting it rest on the carpet between them. "But you don't have to wait anymore," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay to let go. It's okay to be happy again." Shadow's eyes met Ben's, and for a moment, Ben saw something shift in them. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion from carrying such a heavy burden for so long. Slowly, cautiously, Ben reached out and touched Shadow's head, running his fingers through the soft white fur. To his surprise, Shadow didn't pull away. Instead, the dog let out a long, deep sigh, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. Then, in a movement that made Ben's heart skip a beat, Shadow shifted his body and lowered his head onto Ben's lap. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with wonder, "I think he understands what you're saying." Ben nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He continued to stroke Shadow's fur, feeling the dog's body gradually relax under his touch. Shadow's eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming deep and even. "Look," Lily said softly, crawling closer, but still maintaining a respectful distance. "He's sleeping." She reached out and very gently patted Shadow's back. "I told you he just needed someone to love him." Ben watched as Shadow slept, truly slept, perhaps for the first time since Caleb's death. The dog's face looked peaceful, the usual tension gone from his features. In that moment, Ben felt something shift in his own heart, a sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe they could all heal together. "He's not alone anymore," Lily whispered, settling down beside them with her stuffed animals. Ben nodded, continuing to stroke Shadow's fur as the dog slept. The morning light filled the room with a warm glow, and for the first time since they'd moved in, Ben felt real hope, not just for Shadow, but for all of them. The dog's trust felt like a gift, a sign that sometimes the most broken things could be mended with enough patience and love. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard as Lily played, her laughter filling the air. Ben watched from the kitchen window while washing dishes, a small smile tugging at his lips. Shadow followed Lily's every movement, his white fur gleaming in the sunlight, maintaining a careful distance but never letting her out of his sight. Lily had been running around, playing an imaginary game with her favorite stuffed animal clutched in her arms. Her pink sneakers kicked up little puffs of dirt as she darted back and forth across the yard. Shadow's ears perked up with each giggle, his head turning to track her movements. "Watch this, Shadow," Lily called out, waving her stuffed animal in the air. She started running faster, her pigtails bouncing with each step. Ben had just set down a plate when he heard it, the sharp cry that made his heart stop. Through the window, he saw Lily stumble, her small body pitching forward onto the rough ground. The stuffed animal flew from her hands, landing a few feet away. "Lily!" Ben's voice cracked with panic as he dropped the dish towel and rushed toward the back door. His hands fumbled with the handle, his mind racing with worry. But before Ben could reach her, Shadow was already there. The dog moved with surprising gentleness, approaching Lily with none of his usual hesitation. His large frame bent down close to her, and his nose nudged her shoulder softly. Lily's sobs quieted as Shadow carefully inspected her scraped knee, his tongue gently licking the small wound. Ben froze in the doorway, amazement replacing his fear. Shadow's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the fearful, withdrawn dog they'd known. In his place was a protective guardian, focused entirely on comforting the little girl. From her porch next door, Miss Edna sat in her usual chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the scene, unfolding in Ben's yard, something unreadable flickering across her weathered face, a mixture of relief and deep sorrow that made her look both younger and older at the same time. Ben quickly crossed the yard and knelt beside Lily, his heart still racing. "Let me see, sweetheart," he said softly, examining her knee. The scrape wasn't deep, just a typical childhood injury that would heal in a few days. A little dirt and a few small pieces of gravel clung to the shallow scratch, but there was no serious damage. Lily's tears had already stopped. She reached out and wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, burying her face in his thick fur. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered, her voice muffled but clear. Shadow sat back on his haunches, his tail sweeping gently across the ground. The dog's eyes were bright and alert, and his tail continued its slow, steady wagging. He looked almost proud, as if pleased with himself for helping Lily. The sound of footsteps drew Ben's attention. Miss Edna had made her way over to them, standing at the edge of the yard. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her eyes never left Shadow. The usual hardness in her expression had softened, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. "He's remembering how to love," Miss Edna murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to catch in her throat, heavy with meaning. Ben felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched Shadow lean into Lily's embrace. This wasn't just about Shadow moving past Caleb's death. It was about the dog finding his way back to who he truly was. Each small gesture of trust, each moment of protection and care, was Shadow relearning how to open his heart. Lily hugged Shadow tightly, her small fingers buried in his fur. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing the embrace with a patience that seemed to come from years of practice. Ben couldn't help but smile at the sight, feeling the depth of the bond that had formed between them. Miss Edna stood quietly for a moment longer, then gave Ben a small, almost imperceptible nod. In that simple gesture, Ben saw acknowledgement and perhaps even a glimmer of hope. Hope that Shadow could indeed overcome his past. Ben jolted awake, his heart hammering against his chest. Sweat trickled down his forehead as fragments of his nightmare lingered. The image of losing everything, of failing Lily, of watching his life crumble away. The darkness of his bedroom pressed in around him, and he took several deep breaths to steady himself. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the window, his gaze fell on Shadow's white form near Lily's bed. The dog was curled up tight, his massive body twitching slightly. Ben watched as Shadow's paws moved in his sleep, scratching at invisible demons. A soft whimper broke the silence of the room. Shadow's body tensed, and another whine escaped him. this one more pained than the last. Ben sat up straighter, his own nightmare forgotten as he watched the dog battle whatever haunted his dreams. Shadow's whimpers grew more distressed, his body shaking now. Ben couldn't help but wonder what memories plagued the dog's sleep. Was he reliving the crash that took Caleb? Was he searching endless roads for his lost master? The thought made Ben's chest ache. In the other bed, Lily stirred. She lifted her head, her hair tousled from sleep. "Daddy?" she whispered, then heard Shadow's whines. Without hesitation, she slipped from her bed and knelt beside the dog. "It's okay, Shadow," she murmured, her small hand finding his fur. "You're safe now." Ben watched in amazement as Shadow's trembling body began to still under Lily's gentle touch. The dog's whimpers faded, replaced by steady breathing. Lily continued to stroke his fur, humming softly under her breath, a lullaby Ben often sang to her. "He has bad dreams too," Lily said quietly, looking up at her father. "Just like when I dream about monsters." Ben slid off his bed and knelt beside his daughter. "I think his dreams might be about something else, sweetheart. Something that really happened." Lily's hand never stopped its gentle motion through Shadow's fur. "Because he misses Caleb." Ben nodded, surprised by his daughter's insight. "Yeah, I think so. Sometimes when we lose someone we love, it hurts for a very long time." Shadow shifted in his sleep, pressing closer to Lily's touch. His breathing had evened out now, but Ben could still see the tension in the dog's body. Even in sleep, Shadow couldn't fully escape his past. Ben watched his daughter comfort the troubled dog, and something heavy settled in his chest. How could anyone heal from such deep wounds? Shadow had lost more than just an owner. He'd lost his purpose, his whole world. The dog had been trained to protect and serve Caleb, and in one terrible moment, that purpose had been ripped away. "Do you think he'll ever be happy again?" Lily asked, her voice small in the darkness. Ben struggled with the question. He wanted to give his daughter hope, but he also couldn't ignore the depth of Shadow's trauma. The dog's progress over the past few days seemed minimal compared to the mountain of grief he carried. "I don't know, sweetie," he answered honestly. "Some hurts take a long time to heal." Lily nodded solemnly, continuing her gentle petting. "Then we'll just have to love him extra hard, right, Daddy?" Ben felt his throat tighten at his daughter's simple wisdom. "Yeah, that's right." Shadow stirred again, but this time instead of whimpering, he let out a soft sigh. His body relaxed further under Lily's touch, some of the tension finally leaving his muscles. Ben glanced at the clock on his bedside table, watching the minutes tick by. His own nightmare seemed distant now, replaced by a deeper understanding of the broken creature before him. Maybe Shadow's healing wasn't about forgetting Caleb or moving on completely. Maybe it was about learning to carry that love differently, to find new purpose while honoring the old. As he sat there in the quiet darkness, Ben realized that he and Shadow weren't so different. They were both carrying wounds, both struggling to trust in a future that seemed uncertain. Ben's fears about failing as a father, about not being able to provide for Lily, about making the wrong choices, they were just as real as Shadow's grief. Lily yawned, her hand still resting on Shadow's fur. "Can I stay here with him? Just for a little while?" Ben nodded, knowing he wouldn't be sleeping much anyway. He watched as Lily settled down next to Shadow, her small body curled protectively around the dog who had been trained to protect others. Shadow's breathing remained steady now, though Ben could still see small twitches that suggested his dreams hadn't completely settled. But with Lily's presence beside him, the dog seemed more anchored, more at peace. Ben leaned back against his bed, watching the clock tick away the minutes of the night. Each tick seemed to echo the rhythm of Shadow's breathing, steady but somehow fragile, like everything could shatter at any moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Ben knelt beside his old Chevy, tools scattered around him. The car needed work, just one more thing on his growing list of responsibilities. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of grease behind. Lily's laughter rang out across the yard as she ran with Shadow, her small feet pattering against the grass. The white German Shepherd kept pace with her, not running at full speed, but matching her stride for stride. It was the most animated Ben had seen Shadow since they'd taken him in. "Look, Daddy!" Lily called out, her face glowing with joy. "Shadow's playing with me!" Ben smiled, watching as his daughter threw a tennis ball, and Shadow bounded after it with surprising energy. The dog's transformation over the past few days had been remarkable. Though still cautious, Shadow seemed to be finding his way back to life, one small step at a time. The peaceful morning shattered with a thunderous crash from next door. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Ben's heart leapt into his throat as he jumped to his feet, tools clattering to the ground. "Lily, stay here!" he shouted, already running toward Miss Edna's house. His boots pounded against the earth as he sprinted across the yard. Shadow's head snapped up at the noise, and the dog was instantly alert, watching Ben's movements with intense focus. Ben reached Miss Edna's front door and found it unlocked. He burst inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Miss Edna!" he called out, his voice tight with worry. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Miss Edna lay crumpled on the floor of her living room, her body twisted at an awkward angle. Her face was ashen, one side drooping unnaturally. A broken vase lay scattered around her, water seeping into the carpet. "Miss Edna!" Ben dropped to his knees beside her, checking for a pulse with trembling fingers. He found it, weak and irregular. But there. She didn't respond to his voice or touch. The sound of claws clicking against hardwood made Ben look up. Shadow had followed him inside and now stood near Miss Edna's head, whining softly. The dog nudged her face with his nose, but she remained still. Shadow's distress was evident in his low, continuous whimpers. Ben fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "I need an ambulance," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "My neighbor, she's collapsed. She's unconscious, and her face, I think it might be a stroke." While he waited for help to arrive, Ben tried to make Miss Edna comfortable without moving her. Shadow stayed close, his eyes fixed on Miss Edna's face, occasionally pawing at her arm as if trying to wake her. "It's okay, boy," Ben murmured, though his own heart was racing. "Help is coming." The minutes crawled by like hours until finally the wail of sirens split the air. 2 paramedics burst through the door with their equipment, quickly assessing the situation. Their movements were swift and professional as they checked Miss Edna's vital signs. "Definite signs of a stroke," one paramedic confirmed grimly. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Ben had to hold Shadow back as they lifted Miss Edna onto the stretcher. The dog wanted to follow, his body trembling with anxiety. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and preparing her for transport. "Is she going to be okay?" Ben asked, his throat tight. "She's critical," the paramedic replied, her face serious. "Time is crucial with strokes. We'll do everything we can." Ben watched helplessly as they wheeled Miss Edna out to the waiting ambulance. Shadow followed them to the gate, his tail low, whining softly as the ambulance doors closed. The siren started up again and the vehicle pulled away, carrying Miss Edna into an uncertain future. Standing at the edge of Miss Edna's yard, Ben felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. Shadow sat quietly by the gate, his eyes fixed on the road where the ambulance had disappeared. The dog's posture spoke of waiting, of expecting Miss Edna to return at any moment. Ben ran his hands through his hair, overwhelmed by the morning's events. He looked down at Shadow, understanding dawning in his heart. This dog, who had already lost so much, might now lose the only other connection to his past. The responsibility of it all felt crushing. Lily appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into his. "Is Miss Edna going to be okay, Daddy?" Ben squeezed her hand, watching as Shadow continued his vigil at the gate. "I don't know, sweetheart," he answered honestly. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as they stood there, the three of them united in their uncertainty. Shadow's eyes remained fixed on the empty road, waiting for a return that might never come. Ben felt the weight of his promise settling onto his shoulders. He would take care of them both, Shadow and Miss Edna, whatever tomorrow might bring. As they walked back to their house, Shadow following slowly behind them, Ben knew their lives had changed yet again. The dog's fate was now completely intertwined with their own, for better or worse. Ben sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under his tired eyes. Every time the double doors swung open, his heart jumped, hoping for news about Miss Edna's condition. A nurse had told him earlier that Miss Edna was stable but critical. The stroke had been severe, and the next 24 hours would be crucial. Ben couldn't shake the image of her lying unconscious on her floor, with Shadow standing guard over her. His thoughts drifted to the white German shepherd back home with Lily. He'd called Mrs. Johnson from next door to watch Lily and Shadow while he was at the hospital. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. The quiet murmur of voices from the hallway caught his attention. Two middle-aged women and a man in a business suit stood just outside the waiting room, their hushed conversation drifting through the open door. "What about that dog of hers?" one of the women asked, her voice tinged with disgust. "The neighbors say it's dangerous." "We'll have to deal with it," the man replied, adjusting his tie. "Can't have a liability like that around, especially not after what happened with Caleb." Ben's stomach clenched as he realized these must be Miss Edna's relatives. He leaned forward, straining to hear more. "I heard it growls at everyone," the second woman added. "Maybe we should just have it put down. It would be easier than trying to rehome an aggressive dog." "No!" Ben couldn't stop himself from speaking. He stood up, drawing their attention. "You can't do that." The three relatives turned to face him, their expressions a mix of surprise and annoyance. The man in the suit stepped forward. "And you are?" "I'm Ben Carter, Miss Edna's neighbor." Ben's voice was firm, despite his racing heart. "That dog isn't dangerous. He's traumatized and needs help, but he's not a threat." The first woman scoffed. "And I suppose you're an expert on dangerous animals?" "No," Ben admitted, "but I know Shadow. He's been staying with my family since Miss Edna's stroke. He's gentle with my 7-year-old daughter. He just needs patience and understanding." "Listen, Mr. Carter," the man said, his tone condescending. "This isn't your concern. That dog is family property, and we'll handle it as we see fit." Ben felt his anger rising. "Shadow isn't property. He's a living being who's already lost one owner. He doesn't deserve to die because you think he's inconvenient." The second woman stepped forward, her face hard. "That dog was my nephew's service animal. After Caleb died, it became aggressive and unstable. We can't risk it hurting someone else." "He's not unstable," Ben insisted. "He's grieving, just like Miss Edna has been grieving. But he's starting to heal. My daughter, Lily, she's helped him remember how to trust again." The relatives exchanged skeptical looks. "Mr. Carter," the man said, "I appreciate your concern, but this isn't up for discussion. Once Aunt Edna's condition stabilizes, we'll make arrangements for the dog." Ben stood his ground. "I won't let you put him down. If you don't want him, I'll take him. Permanently." "You have no right," the first woman began, but Ben cut her off. "I have every right to fight for an innocent life. Shadow isn't just some problem to be solved. He's part of our family now, and I won't let you destroy him because it's convenient." The man's face reddened. "Are you threatening legal action, Mr. Carter?" "If I have to," Ben replied, surprised by his own determination. "But I'm hoping you'll see reason first. Come meet Shadow. See how he is with my daughter. Then make your decision." The relatives huddled together, whispering among themselves. Ben's heart pounded as he waited. Finally, the man turned back to him. "We'll consider your offer, Mr. Carter. But make no mistake, if that dog shows any sign of aggression, we won't hesitate to take appropriate action." Ben nodded, relief flooding through him. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. Hours later, Ben finally returned home. The house was quiet, except for the soft sound of Lily's voice coming from the living room. He found her sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around Shadow's neck. "Is Miss Edna going to be okay, Daddy?" Lily asked, looking up at him with worried eyes. Ben sat down beside them, reaching out to pat Shadow's head. The dog leaned into his touch, those intelligent eyes watching him carefully. "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetheart," he said softly. "What about Shadow?" Lily's arms tightened around the dog. "He can stay with us, right?" Ben looked at his daughter and the dog, who had become such an important part of their lives in such a short time. Shadow's head rested on Lily's lap, his white fur glowing in the dim light. There was no sign of the aggressive, dangerous animal Miss Edna's relatives had described. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he stays with us," Ben promised, pulling Lily close. She nestled into his side, and Shadow shifted to press against both of them. "He needs us, Daddy," Lily whispered. "We're his family now." Ben held his daughter tightly, watching as Shadow's eyes began to drift closed, finally relaxed in their presence. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but looking at them together, he had no doubts about his decision. Whatever it took, he would protect Shadow. The dog deserved a chance at happiness, and Ben was determined to make sure he got it. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as Ben sat on his worn wooden porch steps. The evening air was cool against his skin, but he barely noticed it. His mind was too preoccupied with the weight of tomorrow's challenges. Miss Edna's relatives were coming, and they'd made their intentions clear. Shadow had to go. Ben watched the white German shepherd lying peacefully on the porch. Shadow's head rested on his paws, but his eyes remained alert, following every movement around him. It seemed impossible that anyone could look at this dog and see danger. All Ben saw was a wounded soul who'd finally started to trust again. The screen door creaked open behind him. Lily's small footsteps padded across the wooden boards until she settled next to her father. Her warm hand found his, and she squeezed it gently. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "Daddy, are we going to lose him?" Ben's heart clenched at the worry in her voice. He looked down at his daughter's upturned face, seeing the fear in her eyes. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Lily's voice, his ears perking up slightly. "No, sweetheart," Ben said firmly, squeezing her hand back. "We're not giving up on him." The determination in his voice surprised even him, but he knew it was true. They couldn't let Shadow go, not now. Not after everything they'd learned about his past with Caleb. Not after watching him slowly emerge from his shell of fear and grief. Ben spent the next hour making phone calls, researching his options. Finally, he kissed Lily goodbye, leaving her with Mrs. Johnson while he drove to the local animal shelter. The building was old, but well-maintained, with cheerful paw print decorations on the windows that seemed at odds with his troubled mood. Inside, the shelter manager, a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, listened patiently as Ben explained the situation. Her office smelled of coffee and pet food, and the walls were covered with photos of successful adoptions. "It's a complicated situation," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "We can't simply override the family's decision. They have legal rights as Miss Edna's next of kin." Ben's heart sank, but the manager wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "you could apply for temporary guardianship of Shadow. You'd need to prove you can provide proper care for him, and that it's in the dog's best interest to stay with you." Hope flickered in Ben's chest as she explained the process. It wouldn't be easy. There would be paperwork, home visits, and likely resistance from Miss Edna's family. But it was possible. "The key," the manager explained, "is demonstrating that moving Shadow would be detrimental to his well-being. Given his history as a service dog and his recent trauma, you might have a strong case." Ben left the shelter with a thick packet of forms and a renewed sense of purpose. The sun had fully set by the time he pulled into his driveway, and the porch light cast a warm glow over Shadow, who was waiting by the door. As Ben approached, Shadow's tail wagged slightly, a small gesture that would have seemed impossible just days ago. The dog's eyes followed him, and Ben could sense something in them, almost like Shadow knew something important was happening. Inside, Ben spread the guardianship papers across the kitchen table. Shadow padded over and sat beside him, watching intently as Ben began filling out the forms. The dog's presence was steady and calming, so different from the snarling, fearful creature they'd first encountered. Ben paused in his writing and turned to Shadow. "I won't let them take you away," he whispered, reaching out to scratch behind the dog's ears. Shadow leaned into his touch, and Ben felt the trust in that simple gesture. Lily appeared in her pajamas, her hair still damp from her bath. She climbed onto Ben's lap and looked at the papers scattered across the table. "What are those for, Daddy?" "These are to help us keep Shadow," Ben explained, holding her close. "We're going to fight for him to stay with us." Shadow moved closer, resting his head on Ben's knee. The three of them sat there together, a family unit formed through unexpected circumstances. Ben gently stroked Shadow's head, feeling the dog's warm breath against his leg. "We're going to fight for you, buddy," Ben said softly. "You're staying with us." Shadow's response was to press his head more firmly against Ben's lap, his body relaxing despite the uncertainty that hung in the air. In that moment, Ben knew with absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front yard as Ben gathered his papers, double-checking each document for the guardianship application. His hands trembled slightly as he organized them into a neat folder. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on his shoulders, making each breath feel heavy. Lily hovered near him in the kitchen, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She hadn't eaten much breakfast, too worried about what would happen today. Shadow lay at her feet, his white fur gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the window. His eyes followed Ben's movements, as if sensing the importance of this moment. "Ready, sweetheart?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice steady and confident for Lily's sake. She nodded, but her bottom lip quivered slightly. As they walked toward the front door, Lily suddenly grabbed Ben's hand, holding it tight. "Daddy, you'll win, won't you?" Her eyes were wide and hopeful, filled with the kind of trust that only children can have in their parents. Ben knelt down to her level, placing his hands on her shoulders. "We'll do our best, sweetheart. We're not giving up on Shadow." He meant every word, even though uncertainty gnawed at his insides. Shadow stood up and padded over to them, his tail low but not tucked. He'd come so far from the aggressive, fearful dog they'd first met. Ben couldn't bear the thought of losing him now. They walked together toward Miss Edna's house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and early autumn. Shadow walked close to Lily, his body language relaxed but alert.
As they approached Miss Edna's house, Ben's heart sank. 3 cars were already parked in the driveway, and he could see figures moving on the porch. Miss Edna's relatives had arrived early, their faces set in stern expressions as they watched Ben's approach.
Marilyn, Miss Edna's niece, stood at the front of the group. Her arms were crossed, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. 2 other relatives flanked her, a tall man Ben assumed was her husband, and an older woman who shared Miss Edna's sharp features. "Mr. Carter," Marilyn said coldly as they reached the porch steps. Her eyes flickered to Shadow, and her frown deepened. "We've already made arrangements to have the dog removed." Ben felt Lily's hand tighten in his. He squeezed back gently before stepping forward, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I've applied for temporary guardianship of Shadow," he said, holding up the folder of papers. "He belongs with us now. We won't allow anyone to take him away." The tall man scoffed, shaking his head. "You have no right?" "Let him speak," came a quiet voice from inside the house. Everyone turned to see Miss Edna in her wheelchair, looking frail but determined. Her eyes were tired, but there was a familiar stubbornness in them that Ben recognized. "I want him to stay," Miss Edna continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "with Ben and his daughter." Marilyn stepped toward her aunt, her voice taking on a condescending tone. "Aunt Edna, you're not thinking clearly. That dog is dangerous." "He's not dangerous," Lily spoke up suddenly, her young voice clear and strong. "He's just sad and scared sometimes, like people get." Ben felt a surge of pride at his daughter's words. Shadow moved closer to Lily, his body language protective but calm, a far cry from the snarling, aggressive dog they'd first encountered. The relatives exchanged glances, their resolve seeming to waver slightly. The older woman spoke up, her voice gentler than the others. Perhaps we could take some time to consider the situation." Marilyn's jaw clenched, but she nodded slowly. "Fine. A few days to make a proper decision. But this isn't over, Mr. Carter." Ben stood his ground, meeting her gaze steadily. "No, it's not. But I want you to understand. We're not giving up on Shadow. He needs us, and we need him." The tension in the air slowly dissipated, though it didn't disappear entirely. The relatives retreated inside with Miss Edna, leaving Ben, Lily, and Shadow standing in the yard. As they walked home, Ben felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty wash over him. The confrontation had gone better than he'd expected, but he knew this was just the beginning. Miss Edna's support had been unexpected and precious, a small victory in what would likely be a longer battle. Lily skipped ahead slightly, her spirits lifted by the temporary reprieve. Shadow walked beside them, his pace steady and sure, as if he knew he was walking toward home rather than away from it. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as Ben descended the stairs. Surprised to find Shadow, his once fearful white shepherd, calmly sitting by the door. Gone was the tension that had gripped the dog for so long. Today, there was something else: trust. When Ben opened the door, Shadow stepped outside with quiet confidence, a sign that he was ready to leave his past behind. Their morning walk took them past Miss Edna's house, the place where Shadow had once been chained and alone. He hesitated, muscles tensing as memories surfaced, but then he turned away, choosing to move forward. As they continued, Lily joined them, her boundless energy weaving warmth into their steps. Shadow responded, his tail swaying gently, a silent acknowledgement that he had found his place. Days later, an ambulance pulled up in front of Miss Edna's home, bringing her back from the hospital. Frail but alert, she was greeted with Lily's excitement and Shadow's hesitant but hopeful approach. As Shadow pressed against her chair, his body protective yet calm, Miss Edna whispered, "You came back to me." In that moment, their broken bond began to mend. With Miss Edna's return, the house transformed. The once cold space became a home, filled with the scent of fresh-baked cookies and the warmth of laughter. Shadow, ever watchful, divided his time between Edna and his new family. One evening, as they all sat on the porch, Miss Edna admitted, "I thought I was too old for second chances." Ben smiled, realizing they were all learning to heal together. As the neighborhood noticed the change in Shadow, fear gave way to admiration. The once feared dog now walked confidently beside Ben and Lily, drawing curious glances rather than wary stares. Even those who had once crossed the street to avoid him began to watch him with softened eyes. Then, one fateful night, Shadow's instincts took over. Ben woke to find him rigid by the front door, his gaze locked on Miss Edna's house. The moment Ben opened it, Shadow bolted across the yard, leading him straight to where Miss Edna lay collapsed on her porch. Shadow pressed against her, his body a shield, his whines urgent. Ben called 911, his hands shaking, realizing that without Shadow, it might have been too late. At the hospital, Lily curled beside Shadow in the waiting room, whispering reassurances to both of them. Hours later, the doctor emerged with news. Miss Edna had suffered another stroke, but was stable. Relief flooded through them. As they left the hospital, Ben looked down at Shadow and whispered, "You saved her." Shadow simply walked beside them, as if he already knew. 2 weeks later, they brought Miss Edna home. The yard was freshly trimmed, the house filled with light, and a sense of peace settled over them all. As Lily helped her bake cookies, Miss Edna smiled, remembering Caleb without pain. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, Ben reassured her, "You're not alone anymore." Edna's eyes shone as she responded, "And neither are you." Shadow, his journey from fear to belonging complete, lay at their feet, his tail thumping in quiet contentment. As the sun set, Ben whispered, "Welcome home." And for the first time, they all truly were. If you enjoyed the story of Ben, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.